Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into something that we all probably encountered in childhood and probably thought was just kind of silly. But it turns out it's really interesting, and that is tongue twisters.
Yeah, absolutely. Tongue twisters are these fascinating little phrases that are designed to really trip up our pronunciation. And they can be really fun and challenging. And what I think is so interesting about them is that they really expose the complexity of human speech. We take for granted how easily we can usually speak, but tongue twisters really kind of show us how many different things have to go right for us to produce sounds accurately.
Yeah, it's almost like a little workout for your mouth,
Yeah.
You're exercising these muscles that you use for speaking all the time, but in ways that you don't normally use them.
Right, exactly.
So I'm really excited to kind of dig into this today. So we have quite a few examples of tongue twisters that we want to go through, ranging from, the classics that everyone's heard of to some more obscure ones. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what makes them so difficult and what are some tips for actually mastering them if you're brave enough to try.
Okay, sounds good.
So let's start with some of the classics. I think everyone's heard of Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Oh, of course.
Like, what is it about that one that just trips everybody up?
I think the main thing is the alliteration, right? The repetition of that P sound at the beginning of so many words. So you have Peter, Piper, pick, peck, pickled, peppers, and your mouth just kind of gets into this groove of making that P sound, and it becomes really hard to stop and start each word cleanly.
Yeah, it's like you get momentum going and then your tongue just wants to keep going.
Yeah.
And then you end up with like, Peter, beeper, pee, pee, pee.
Yeah, exactly. And the hook sound in there too, picked and peck. Those are also what we call stop consonants, where you have to completely stop the airflow and then release it. So combining that with the P sound, it's just a recipe for a tongue twister.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay, how about this one? This is another classic. She sells seashells by the seashore. What's going on there?
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I know I always mess that one up.
Yeah, that one's tricky too. I think the main challenge there is the similarity between the sus and she's sounds. They're both what we call fricative consonants, which means that you're creating this hissing sound by forcing air through a narrow space in your mouth.
Right, okay.
But the position of your tongue is slightly different for each sound. And when you're trying to say them quickly, one after the other, it's really easy for them to kind of blend together.
And it's like your brain knows there's a difference, but your mouth just can't quite get it right.
Exactly. It's a very subtle difference, but it makes a big difference in terms of pronunciation.
Okay, let's try a couple more classics here. How about Betty Botter bought some butter, but she said the butter's bitter. Now that one's a little bit longer, but I feel like it still has those same kind of traps in it.
Yeah, it does. You still have that alliteration with the B sound in Betty, botter, bought, butter, but butters, bitter. And then you also have the T sound in botter, bought, butter, butters. So again, your mouth is kind of getting stuck in these patterns of repeating those sounds.
And I think the thing that gets me with that one is but she said the butter's bitter part. It's like,
Yeah.
that's where I always trip up. It's like too many words that sound too similar, too close together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting how these tongue twisters often tell these little stories like Betty Botter buying butter. It almost makes it more engaging, but then it also makes it harder because you're trying to keep track of the story while also saying the words correctly.
Okay, one more classic, and then we'll move on to some different categories. This one's a little bit different. Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear. Fuzzy Wuzzy had no hair. Fuzzy wasn't very fuzzy, was he? What do you think's going on there?
Okay, so that one is definitely a mouthful. And I think what makes that one so tricky is the combination of the F sound and the W sound, particularly in that phrase fuzzy wuzzy. So both F and W are what we call labiodental consonants, which means that they're made with your lower lip and your upper teeth. But the way you use your tongue is slightly different for each sound.
Ah, okay.
And when you're trying to say them quickly, one after the other, it can be really easy to get them mixed up.
Yeah, because they both kind of involve the lips in a similar way. It's like you have to make a very subtle adjustment to get from one to the other.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the repetition of fuzzy wuzzy throughout, which just compounds the challenge.
It's funny how sometimes it's the simplest words that can be the hardest to say.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, so those were some of the classics. But as I mentioned, there are lots of other categories of tongue twisters out there. And I'm curious, what are some other ways that these tongue twisters are categorized?
Well, one way to categorize them is by length. So you have these short ones that we just talked about, but then there are also longer tongue twisters that can be even more challenging. And then there are also tongue twisters that are themed around certain topics like animals or food or colors.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about the sounds, but also about the content of the phrases.
Right, exactly. And I think the content can sometimes add an extra layer of difficulty because it can be distracting. Like if you're trying to say a tongue twister about animals, you might start thinking about the animals, and that can take your focus away from the pronunciation.
Okay, so let's look at some of these other categories. How about longer tongue twisters? Do you have any good examples of those?
Yeah, let me think. Oh, here's one. How can a cram in a clean cream can? That one's pretty classic.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I could already feel my tongue getting twisted just reading it.
And what's challenging about that one is you've got a lot of repetition of those C and K sounds. You've got can, clam, cram, clean, cream, all in close proximity. And those are all stop consonants, so it's a lot of starting and stopping of the airflow.
Right, and the L and the R sounds in there too.
Mm.
Clam, cram, cream. Like a lot of different sounds that are all kind of competing with each other.
Yeah, definitely. And longer tongue twisters like that can be a good test of your breath control too, because you need to be able to say the whole thing without running out of air.
Okay, do you have another example of a longer one?
Let's see. Oh, how about this one? Slim sycamore saplings. That one's a real mouthful.
Oh my gosh, that's like the ultimate sibilance challenge.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about that sick, slick, slim, sycamore saplings. It's just nonstop
I like
in
that
sounds.
sounds too.
Yeah,
Like slick, slim, it's like a recipe for a lisp.
right. Exactly. And it's not just about being able to say the Z's sound correctly once. It's about being able to repeat it over and over again without your tongue getting tired.
Okay, and you mentioned themed tongue twisters. What are some of the themes that you've come across?
Well, one common theme is animals. Like, we already talked about Fuzzy Wuzzy being a bear, but there are lots of other ones too, like Wayne went to Wales to watch walruses. Or the big black bug bit the big black bear, but the big black bear bit the big black bug back.
Oh, those are good. I like the repetition of Big Black in that last one. It's like very dramatic.
It is, and it's also a good example of how tongue twisters can be used to teach kids about different animals.
That's a good point. It's like educational and entertaining at the same time.
Exactly. And then another common theme is food. Like Betty Botter bought some butter, or how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Oh, yeah, that woodchuck one is a classic. And I think it's funny because it's not really about food. It's more about, like, an animal's ability to chuck wood, which is, not something that you normally think about.
Right, exactly. And I think that's part of the appeal of tongue twisters, is that they often deal with these kind of absurd or nonsensical situations.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with different categories of tongue twisters. But now I'm curious, what are some tips for actually practicing these and trying to master them?
Okay, well, the first tip is to start slowly. Don't try to say the tongue twister as fast as you can right away. Break it down into smaller chunks and focus on getting each sound correct.
Right, like, don't try to run before you can walk.
Exactly. And then once you've got the individual sounds down, you can start to increase the speed gradually. And it's important to repeat the tongue twister many times. The more you practice, the easier it will become.
Yeah, like with anything, it's all about repetition and muscle memory.
Exactly. And then lastly, the most important tip is to have fun. Don't get too frustrated if you're not getting it right away. Just relax, enjoy the challenge, and embrace the silliness of it all.
Yeah, because ultimately, tongue twisters are supposed to be fun, right? It's not like
Mhm.
a serious competition or anything.
Right. It's all about playing with language and seeing what your mouth can do.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different tongue twisters today. Do you have any final thoughts or any parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
I think my parting thought would be to just encourage people to explore the world of tongue twisters and to see what they can discover. There are so many different ones out there, and I think it's really fascinating to see how they play with different sounds and different themes. And even if you don't master every tongue twister you try, I think the process of practicing them can be really beneficial for your speech and your overall awareness of language.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it. So to our listeners, go forth and twist those tongues. And until next time, happy deep diving.